Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to The Inugami Curse by Seishi Yokomizo. Translated by Yumiko Yamazaki. Inside the Chinese chest. It was over. Comparison of the handprints had proven without a doubt that the man in the strange mask was Kyo Inugami. Take and Tomo had merely been building castles in the air when they had thought that maybe, just maybe, someone else had come back disguised as Kyo. Yet, why was it that dissatisfaction still hung heavy in the air, despite the clearly stated verdict? Why was it that everyone looked like they were suppressing something they wanted to say? All right, so the two handprints were identical. Was it possible, though, to forge fingerprints in some way? Even if that could not be done, had some trick or gimmick been involved? Although it was not surprising to see such doubts on the hostile faces of the other family members, why, strange to say, did even Kyo's mother, Matsuka, seem confused? Why, at the moment Fujisaki declared that the man sitting beside her was without a doubt her son, did an incomprehensible look of agitation pass over her face? Matsuko, though, was too cool to be disconcerted for long. She immediately composed herself and looked pointedly around at the others in the room with her usual malicious expression. Eventually, she said in her catty way, "You all heard the results. Does anyone want to raise any objections? If you do, please state them here and now." Of course, everyone had objections. They just did not know how they should phrase them, because everyone remained waiting silently. Matsuko repeated, driving home her point. "Since no one seems to want to say anything, I assume you all have no complaints? In other words, you recognize that this man is Kyo. Chief Tachibana, thank you very much. Kyo, shall we go?" Matsuko stood up, and after her the masked Kyo. Was it because his legs were numb from sitting rigid on the tatami so long that he seemed to totter a bit? Just then, however, Kindaichi noticed it again. Tamayo half opening her mouth to speak. Breathless, he stared intently at Tamayo's lips. But this time, too, she shut her lips tightly and lowered her eyes. Matsuko and Kyo were no longer in the room. What had Tamayo intended to say? She had started to speak not once, but twice, and her expression and determination had indicated that she was about to say something most important. For that very reason, Kindaichi felt indescribably irritated at her hesitation. In hindsight, he should have insisted that she speak her mind, even if he had to force her, for if she had, he could have solved at least half of the case then and there. More than that, he might have been able to prevent the crimes that were to occur. "Well," Chief Tachibana said with almost a sigh of relief after the family members had left the room.
At least we've made some progress by verifying that masked man's identity. In these kinds of cases, there's nothing you can do but peel away the mysteries, one by one, like the layers of an onion.
That same day, the body of Take, which had been fished out of the lake, was autopsied and returned to the Inugami villa. According to the autopsy findings, the cause of death was a single stab wound in the back, toward the chest, with death probably occurring sometime between 11 and 12 the previous night. What was interesting, however, was that from the appearance of the wound, it was concluded that Take had been fatally stabbed not with a Japanese sword, but with something like a dagger. The moment he heard the contents of this report, Kindaichi's interest was aroused. True, a dagger would suffice to take someone's life, but decapitating a corpse with one would be impossible. Did the murderer then have two types of weapons ready? A dagger and something to cut off the head? In any case, because Take's body had been returned to the family, a perfunctory wake was held that night at the Inugami villa, with Oyama, the priest of Nasu Shrine, performing the services in accordance with the Inugami's Shinto beliefs. Kindaichi too ended up attending the wake, and it was there that he heard a strange story from the priest. Guess what, Mr. Kindaichi? I found something interesting the other day. Oyama must have been drunk from the liquor that had been served, for why else would he seek out Kindaichi expressly to tell him such a tale as he then related? What did you find? The priest grinned wickedly at Kindaichi's question. Well, perhaps I shouldn't use the word interesting, but it's about old Sahe's secret. It's an open secret, since everyone in these parts knows about it. But recently I found proof. What is this secret of Mr. Inugami's you're talking about? Asked Kindaichi, his curiosity piqued. Oyama contorted his oily face with a sleazy smile. You know what I mean? Or maybe you don't. No, surely you must. After all, whenever people tell the story of Sahe Inugami, they always tack this secret on at the end, said Oyama suggestively. You know that there was a homosexual relationship between Sahe and Tamayo's grandfather, the Ini no Nomiya, don't you? What? Kindaichi blurted out loudly, but immediately came to himself and glanced around. Fortunately, the others at the wake were all gathered together in a far corner of the room, and no one was paying Kindaichi any heed. Flustered, he gulped down all the tea in his cup. For Kindaichi, the priest's revelation was a bolt out of the blue. This was one aspect of Sahe's life that was not mentioned in the life of Sahe Inugami, and Kindaichi was hearing about it for the first time. Surprised in turn by the intensity of Kindaichi's amazement, Oyama blinked and said, Then you didn't know about this? No, I didn't. The life of Sahe Inugami said nothing about it, even though it went into quite a lot of detail about Sahe's relationship with Daini no Nomiya. Of course, it's not something people say out in the open, but everybody around here knows about it. Didn't Mr. Furudate say anything? Furudate was a gentleman and no doubt had refrained from commenting on other people's private affairs indiscriminately. Yet, perhaps this fact that there had been a homosexual relationship between Daini and Sahe was somehow affecting the current case. Kindaichi remained lost in thought for some time. His eyes seemed to peer into a deep abyss. Eventually, however, he looked up and said, "You just said that you had discovered some proof of this. What kind of proof?" Although the priest had at last begun to show some signs of embarrassment at his indiscretion, he still could not restrain himself from divulging his discovery to someone. "Yes, the proof," he began, leaning forward and blowing breath reeking of liquor in Kindaichi's face. According to Oyama, he had recently had to rearrange some articles stored in the shrine treasure hall and had discovered an old Chinese chest there. Hidden beneath dust and piles of junk as it was, he had never noticed it before, but the lid, he saw, had been carefully sealed shut with a strip of paper that had something written on it in ink. So old and black with soot was the paper, however, that he could not discern what was written at first, but after much effort he finally made out the following characters. Sealed in the presence of Daini no Nomiya and Sahe Inugami, March 25, 1911. March 25, 1911. The date struck a familiar chord. If you have read the life of Sahe Inugami, you know that Daini no Nomiya died in May of 1911. The Chinese chest, therefore, was sealed by the two men a little before Daini passed away. Probably, Daini had realized he didn't have long to live and, together with Sahe, stored something in the chest. That's what I surmised. So, you broke the seal? At Kindaichi's somewhat accusatory tone, the priest hurriedly waved his right hand in remonstrance. No. It's misleading to say I broke the seal. Like I said, the strip of paper was quite old. It was completely moth-eaten, and seal or no seal, the chest came open just like that when I lifted the lid. I see. So you just happened to look inside, and what did you find? An unbelievable number of documents, enough to fill up the whole chest. Letters, account books, diaries, notebooks, everything on washi paper, since it was a long time ago. I read a few of the letters and found they were, well, love letters that Daini and old Sahe had exchanged. Of course, back then he wasn't old Sahe, but a strapping young man. So, Oyama said, and smirked as if someone had tickled him. He immediately continued, however, as if to justify himself. Mr. Kindaichi, I don't want you to think that I've been consumed by some kind of vulgar curiosity. I respect Sahe Inugami. I revere him. After all, he was not only a benefactor to all the people of Nasu, but the most distinguished man in the Shinshu region as well. I just want to know what this great man was really like. In fact, I'd like to write his biography someday. I want to depict his real, undisguised self, not the glossed over portrait they give in the Life of Sahi Inugami. I'm certain that it would in no way harm his memory, but in fact would show his true greatness. For that reason, I intend to examine the contents of that Chinese chest thoroughly. I think I might find some valuable document that no one else has ever known about before. It was just drunken spiel. Oyama was intoxicated on his own words, and he did not even believe himself. Yet, long after everything was over, Kindaichi would still shudder every time he remembered the remarkable secret the priest would soon discover in the Chinese chest, and how heavily it would weigh upon this case. Pomegranate. Nowadays, it is rare to find a full-scale, all-night wake. In most cases, a wake will end in the evening around 10 or 11. A half-wake, if you will. With a family like the Inugami Clan, moreover, in which the members despised each other, only the deceased parents and sister saw any reason to keep vigil by his body throughout the night. Besides, it was not very pleasant to be near a corpse whose head and body had been sewn back together. So, as Furudate, the family lawyer, proposed, the wake was brought to a close at 10. The storm had abated considerably by then, but ink-black clouds still rushed across the sky, and occasionally the wind, as if recalling its purpose, would blow the lingering rain in gusts from the side. It was after Kindaichi and Furudate had left in this rain that another incident occurred at the Inugami villa. Compared to the murder of Take the previous night, or the two killings that were to follow, this episode might at first glance have seemed trivial, but the full extent of its import was to become clear later on. The incident, again, revolved around Tamayo. When the wake ended, Tamayo returned immediately to the sitting room in her annex. This annex, like Matsuko's and Kiyo's, was connected to the main part of the villa by a corridor and also had 5 rooms, its own entrance and a bathroom. The only difference being that Tamayo's had been designed mostly in Western style. For several years now, Tamayo had lived here with Monkey. As Tamayo reached her annex, Take's younger sister, Sayoko, came chasing after her, saying that she needed to talk. With all that had happened since morning, Tamayo was completely exhausted and wanted to take a bath and retire as quickly as possible. But she felt she could not refuse Sayoko's request. So, according to Tamayo, she showed Sayoko into her sitting room. What was the subject of their conversation? I just wanted to ask her about my brother, Sayoko said. I heard that he had seen Tamayo right before he was killed, so I wanted to hear from her directly what she remembered about that night. Thus, she explained when questioned by the police the following day, and Tamayo corroborated her story. Yet, anyone with the least bit of inside knowledge about certain private matters in the Inugami household would have guessed that there must have been more. Sayoko had come to find out how Tamayo felt, how she felt about Tomo. Sayoko was an unfortunate girl. She was in no way homely, and in fact, on her own, was quite above average in appearance. However, because there was a ravishing beauty, an incomparably exquisite creature living in the same villa, Sayoko's attractiveness paled in comparison, just as the stars lose their sparkle before the glow of the moon. Yet, until the reading of Sahe's will, Sayoko had never considered herself at a disadvantage to Tamayo. In fact, it would be more correct to say she had thought Tamayo a non-entity. Granted, Tamayo was beautiful, but she was a penniless orphan, a freeloader living on charity doled out by strangers. Sayako, in comparison, though admittedly less of a beauty, had factors on her side to compensate, and more, her social standing as Sahe Inugami's granddaughter, and the guarantee that someday she would come into a share of his enormous fortune. So, if a man were to compare her and Tamayo, she was dead sure that unless he were a fool or a lunatic, he would choose her, Sayoko, as indeed Tomo had done without hesitation. For some reason, Sayoko had always been fond of her cousin Tomo, even as a child. As she grew older, that emotion had gradually turned to love. Tomo, for his part, did not dislike Sayoko, but it was doubtful whether his feelings were as earnest or sincere as hers. Nevertheless, he accepted her love. Tomo's calculating parents, thinking that a marriage between the two would be the best way to grab hold of as much of the Inugami fortune as possible, in fact, strove to ingratiate themselves with Sayoko and prevailed upon their son to do the same. Now, however, the situation had changed. Sayoko, whom they had thought to be the goose that would lay the golden egg, became worthless to them, while Tamayo, whom they had not so much as noticed before, suddenly glittered with a halo of gold. Not surprisingly, the fickle-hearted Tomo and his parents immediately reversed their attitude and turned as cold as ice towards Sayoko, while they began to fawn shamelessly over Tamayo. Sayoko probably came that night seeking to learn Tamayo's feelings. It must have been unbearably humiliating for her. Yet she still could not keep herself from coming. For ever since morning she had been tormented by heart-wrenching anguish and worry. Now that Take was dead, the likelihood that Tamayo would choose Tomo for her husband had increased tremendously. For, after all, of the two remaining candidates, Kiyo had a face too dreadful to behold. No doubt, however, it will forever remain a mystery to us what words were exchanged between the two women in Tamayo's sitting room. Wresting that information from Sayoko would be harder than making a stone statue speak. And Tamayo, always discreet, would not say anything that would disgrace Sayoko.
Be that as it may, the two women's conversation came to an end in about half an hour. Having seen Sayoko out, Tamayo immediately turned toward the adjoining bedroom. Her sitting room and bedroom were both Western-style rooms, and there was no way in or out of the bedroom except through the door connecting it to the sitting room. Tamayo could not wait to lie down and rest, so as soon as Sayoko had left, she opened the door to the bedroom and flipped on the light switch on the wall by the door. The moment she did, however, a terrible scream escaped from her throat. The next day, Tamayo described the event to Chief Tachibana.
Yes, that is right. The moment I turned on the lights, someone came tearing out of the bedroom. It was so sudden, I can't be precise as to details, but for sure it was a man in a soldier's uniform. He had on a field cap pulled low over his brow and hid his face with a muffler. So even now my clearest impression is of his two glinting eyes. He came at me like a whirlwind and I screamed. Then he knocked me aside and flew out of my sitting room into the corridor. The rest is as you heard from the others.
Why was this man hiding in your bedroom? Do you have any idea?
I do have a theory, Tamayo replied to Tachibana's query. I didn't notice last night when I came back to this annex because I was with Sayoko, but checking afterwards, I realized that someone had rummaged through the sitting room. There's nothing missing though. I think he must have been there looking for something when Sayoko and I came back, so he hurriedly hid in the bedroom. As you can see, this bedroom has only this one exit, and since the windows were all closed, opening one of them would have caused a noticeable sound, so he could do nothing but wait in the bedroom until Sayoko left.
I see. That would make sense. But what was this man looking for? Do you possess anything that he might want?
I have no idea. Whatever he was looking for, though, must have been very small, because he had opened up every tiny drawers. Because he had opened up even tiny drawers that could only hold things like rings and earrings.
And yet, nothing is missing?
Nothing. Let us return the account to the actions of the intruder after he had rushed out of Tamayo's room. Tamayo's scream reached even the farthest ends of the extensive Inugami Villa, and interestingly, this provided all the members of the family with alibis. Kiyo, first of all, was in his room in Matsuko's annex, a fact that was confirmed not only by Matsuko, but by Oyama, the priest, as well. Oyama was staying at the Inugami Villa for the night, and had been deep in conversation with Matsuko in her room when they heard the scream. The priest described what had happened. Yes, it must have been about 10:30. Mrs. Matsuko and I were talking in her room when all of a sudden we heard a woman scream. Mr. Kiyo came running in from his room saying it was Miss Tamayo's voice, and then he leapt barefoot into the garden. We were astounded and followed him onto the veranda, but we could no longer see him by then. It was pitch black last night, and unfortunately it had started raining hard again at just about that time. Toronasuke, on the other hand, was still keeping vigil by his son's corpse with Takeko, as attested to by 3 maids who were tidying up after the wake. Toronasuke did not even stir when he heard the scream. Last, Tomo and his father, Kokichi, were preparing to retire in their own rooms. This was witnessed not only by Kokichi's wife, Umeko, but by two maids who had come to lay the futon. When Tomo heard the scream, he turned white as a sheet and dashed out despite his mother's protestations. Kokichi raced after him. The one who heard Tamayo scream from the closest vantage point was, of course, Sayoko. She had come out of Tamayo's room and had reached the middle of the corridor leading to the main part of the house. But when she heard the scream, she ran back in alarm. When she came to the entrance of Tamayo's sitting room, she saw two shadows struggling at the far end of the corridor. One of the shadows was a man in military uniform, and the other was Monkey.
What? You're saying Monkey was struggling with the man in the military uniform?
Asked Chief Tachibana. No wonder he was so surprised. The chief had suspected Monkey of being the man in the uniform, but now his theory had been shattered. Yes, without a doubt. Not only did I see them with my own eyes, I even talked to Monkey right after that, Sayoko explained. As the two men struggled, their relative positions became reversed, and at that instant the uniformed man swiftly darted out the French window at the end of the corridor, beyond which was a balcony leading down into the garden.
I could have run after him, but I was worried about Missy,
explained Monkey, recounting his actions of that evening. Because of all the disturbing things that had occurred recently, Monkey had decided to make the rounds of the villa that night. He had mistakenly assumed that the wake would continue until the morning, and so had not realized that it had already ended and Tamayo had returned to her annex. Then he heard the scream.
Nearly jumped out of my skin, I did. I ran up the balcony, in through the French window, and smack into this guy dressed like a soldier.
Nah, didn't see his face. He had it hidden with his muffler. As Monkey and Sayoko, who had both hastened into the sitting room, were tending to Tamayo, Tomo and his father, Kokichi, came running in. They were all arguing about what they should do when they heard another scream. A high-pitched, trailing scream that pierced the driving rain. They looked at each other, horror-struck. It sounded like a man's voice, Tamayo gasped. Yes, Tomo muttered with frightened eyes. It came from the direction of the observation deck. I think it might have been Kiyo, Sayoko whispered with quivering voice, and Tamayo sprang to her feet. Let's go, she said. Let's all go and see. Monkey, bring the flashlight. It was pouring outside. As they ran together through the rain, Toranosuke and Oyama, the priest, came up to them from another direction.
What happened? What was that scream?
Barked Toranosuke. We don't know, answered Tomo. We think it might have been Kiyo. They again began running toward the observation deck. It had indeed been Kiyo's scream. Lying sprawled at the foot of the stairs to the observation deck, he was first discovered by Tamayo, as she stumbled over his prostrate body in the dark and lost her balance. There's somebody lying here, she said. Monkey, let me have the flashlight. The moment the beam from the flashlight illuminated Kiyo's face, everyone cried out and edged back instinctively. Kiyo was not dead, but unconscious. His mask must have come off as he fell, however. Lying exposed for all to see was that hideous face, like a pomegranate that had ripened and burst. The reddish-black, formless mass of flesh extending from his nose to his cheeks. When Sayoko saw it, she screamed and covered her eyes. But Tamayo, for some reason, continued to stare intently into the horrifying countenance.